Boom. There we go. Last round we had some issues with the recording, so we had to pause. The app is sent. Does everyone have it? Nod from Justin, nod from Kelsey, nod from, okay, cool. Inherency A, biometrics and immigration is expanding and there's no foreseeable end to it. Title 19, revised form changes requires every applicant and co-applicant subject to biometric collections. USCIS remains focused on increasing and setting anticipate an expansion of biometrics. B, the ubiquitous nature of the biometric state is a creeping manifestation of the biopolitical governing through risk. Biometrics, which uses improbable threats to national security to defend liberalism's modernity through expanding borders and sovereignty into every space possible. Its ease in transition makes it the top tool of liberalism's power. Mueller 10, border security transformations towards border management and deeper governance of the bodies across border. The body itself becomes a side of sovereignty. Emerging biometrics is ultimately be a strip serve neoliberalism strategies and border security or violent defense of liberalism. The French word logic, humanity, uncertainty, and governing and governable originary fiction and sovereignty is forgotten. The proliferation of borders to enhance and increase reliance on surveillance and identification tech. Advantage 1 is the virtual wall. A, biometric collection and sharing significantly increases the chance of inaccuracy, deportation, and is creating a dangerous precedent of governmentality. Lynch 12, purpose can easily devolve, does not wait to convict, to deport, and directly affects the community policing efforts, extension, and collection, sharing, and biometric data raise significant concerns. Data sharing perpetuates inaccuracies at a level not before possible. Data fluidity makes it difficult to determine origin. Increases inaccuracies perpetuated through all data collected for non-criminal purposes and combined with national security with no standards, oversight, or transparency. B, the virtual wall constructed through biometrics justifies continued expansion of securitization through endless wars in an unquestionable post-political state that invades everyday life through its policing. During 10, virtual wall on the border of securitized reduction of violence treaty issues akin to war strengthening the central state and the state's questioning policy. Only war preparation can maintain order of the policing, reduce the state dominion, creating a new geopolitics based on law enforcement. It's at the border of the sovereign societies with life is willing to ban a permanent state accession which are to live in the sovereign possible non-problematic virtual wall reduces the appearance management convenience of the state in everyday life. The biometric borders as central to the war on terror derives into a politics of fear. Advantage 2 is racialized surveillance. A, biometrics are portrayed as universal through prototypical whiteness, which produces unequal power relations through seemingly neutral tech of racialized surveillance. Brown 15. Epidermalization is present in biometric adequately used as fake fingerprint ridges. Workers that have highly worn fingerprints. Asian may have fingerprint ridges. The unmeasurability forms body discrimination and temporal unequal power relations are reproduced and reinforced by technological means. Track religious whiteness, prototypical whiteness, and biometrics to the extent of the general culture of light can't be understood without the dark matter that gets culture that clustered in one end of the spectrum, racializing surveillance. B, the biometric surveillance enacts a digital epidermalization where bodies are positioned as ontologically insecure and subject to post-racial humanist structures of recognition. These tools of anti-black intelligibility are weaponized in immigration where racialized subject becomes desire through white gaze authorizing structured violence. Round 9, reveals racializing biometric post-racial humanism through epidermalization. Ontological insecurity, the racial body is experienced being through others' consciousness. The racialized subject does not hold itself out like it is. Digital epidermalization when you conceptualize the body made biometric, the body code is data relying on a database. The notion of body being ontologically insecure and institutional sites, international border crossing these sites necessitate ontological insecurity and denied relation for anti-black racism, whiteness is being normed and enabling the structured violence and recognition power cast out by surveillance. C, mandatory biometric screening is championing the new algorithmic Jim Crow, seemingly immune from challenge and criticism while disparately impacting the racialized other. Q17, mass data collection and names homeland security claims of equal protection violations, collapse big data vetting, not transfer to the screening, the denial of benefit consequences of detaining, deportation, algorithmic Jim Crow demonstrates how Jim Crow regimes can adapt and evolve historical artifact present in colorblind border colorblind mass incarceration, carelessness, mandatory database screening, and disparate impacts on the back end hard to challenge judicially because it's difficult to document big data surveillance transforms into normalized day-to-day governance practice as a result of avoiding reasonable suspicion. Plan, the United States federal government should implement immigration reform that removes biometric restrictions on legal immigration into the United States. I will clarify or spec and CX of Ash, word 17. Biometric screening, more to impose biometric screening of immigrants, DHS and its biometric border screening program resources wasted retains biometric info for years. The biometric border screening program system is a part of a larger replica of biometric surveillance. Solvency. A, biometrics is a modern form of slave branding. Critical biometric consciousness is uniquely needed at the border to reverse and resolve larger systems of humanism and systemic violence. Part 15. Biometric check is in alignment with the quantification of blackness of aspects citizens are information by biometric surveillance and sorted databases, histories, accounting the body, and the inventory station manifest branding checkers tracking blackness to make bodies legible as property, racializing surveillance and biometric examining biometric understanding social relations and enables at the border territorial epidermal of digital where certain bodies are cast out the critical biometric consciousness by an alternative humanism problems on the being of equal worth or powerful problems in humanity. The raciology can be realized as rethinking seeks the right to human behavior from the other. B, critical biometric consciousness in immigration is an integral starting point to rectify the repercussions of big data biometrics and using biopolitical tools of risk to reinforce racialized stereotypes. Q17. Critical biometric consciousness educate on biometrics, how they rely on reinforce social racialization, discrimination, modern vetting and screening, promulgated by crime mitigation, heavy cyber and big data, rely on protective social policy is crucial. Biometrics of veneer, scientific, objectivity, technological infallibility, scientific surveillance, tech identify features in the constitutory framework that requires mobilizing racial and gender categories or racial nomenclature regarding simply accurate is alive and well into science. Biometrics relies on other translations categories. Mass surveillance for terrorism, isolating crimes to be targeted for detention, for how we protect in the face of biometric analysis. Now, framing A. Do not be fooled. The app is not a defense of modernity or humanism. We offer specific subversive restrictions on the state. Mapping what the state has access to is needed to actualize our futures. By rank 12. We need answers to questions. The logistics think the war machine relies on racism, sexism, cap, no, you love the things that we want to intervene. We would be effective with producing change, saying so to verify the points to maps of violence, so you can strategically intervene to destroy them, to deconstruct and intervening the material, which is visual centers of reliant all forms of life done possible at the good mapping of terrain. B. Hold this sets to 0% probability. Their internal link story relies on the conjunctive fallacy. Peel 96. As the narrative unfolds, one event is linked to another, making a script that seems plausible. At least statistics behind experimentation, possible story can lead us to hold probable events we consider improbable, offering up a sequence of events causally links to the effect of raising the estimate of probability. Even a probability the first link is low, the fact is forgotten. Comparable probability is probability calculated on conditional probability. Story takes everlasting, seems sure, gives a story natural tendencies tend to do the rest. And C. We are statutory restrictions. DHS 18. Biometric pursuant to the numerous laws of 2002 Enhanced Border Security Visa Reform Act of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 and implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007. I am going to read another.
You good?
Nope. I still have 11 seconds. So, immigration surveillance is an immigration restriction. It's legal control in undesirable populations. McConnell 14. Biometric immigration surveillance at the border. The science emerged with the calls for stricter restrictions at the border. Fortified medical border restricted and undesirable migrants carrying out for teens. Cool. I will put that in the bottom.
Okay. Can I get that card before I start crossing?
Oh yeah. Go ahead. That is to be expected. I put the C card in there thinking that would be enough because, you know, as the tournament goes on, you get faster because you speak more often, and I've gotten a lot faster since that I thought it's in there, and I've deleted the old one.
Okay, let me pull this up and then I'll start crossing next.
No problem, Quan.
Okay. You good?
Mm-hmm.
The tie-in evidence indicates that, or I guess, how is biometrics a restriction on immigration? Does it stop people from coming in, or does it lead to deportations?
We say, the way it stops people from coming in and can lead to deportation.
So why, or I guess what standard they stop people from coming in when they biometrically surveil them?
Like the McConnell 14 evidence talks about the immigration surveillance and how biometric is the immigration restriction. So it says like biometric databases are called for stricter immigration restrictions. So like biometrics are used to keep people out. Like Agamben didn't get to come into the United States because of biometrics. So he was restricted from coming in, which is really funny. He called it biopolitical.
Yeah, the impacts of your first advantage seem to be predicated off of solving for securitization. How does it resolve for securitization outside of just the border?
So our evidence says that the border is specific in how that's like where the sovereign gets to expand its securitization. So we would say 1 at the border means that we get the strong link and it spills over. 2, we say that biometrics and they're restricted, like they're restricting at the border, but they have ramifications.
Okay, I have a follow-up question. You mentioned the sovereign and like government sovereign control over things. Why don't things like the death penalty thump? I mean, the death penalty is sovereign control over who gets to live and who gets to die.
Yeah, our evidence would contextualize that biometrics is worse than that. It says like
how is keeping people out of the U.S. worse than choosing who lives and dies?
Because it decides what life is willing to ban. Also, like the death penalty isn't used that much. Biometrics are used day to day. Like it is a normalized.
I guess like even if you resolve for like the sovereign in relation to the border, how does it resolve for things like the fact that we have other immigration restrictions?
Other immigration restrictions. It's a question of like border security and the transition towards technology. That's what Mueller-10 isolates. Also, A and B of solvency articulate that removing biometrics is sufficient to spill over in other areas. The discussion the affirmative provides allows for this.
I think, sure, that's fine. The racialized surveillance advantage, is the evidence specific to immigration or just that biometrics are racist? Like, are biometrics racist within the immigration system or just in general?
So Brown talks about it at the border. So like the evidence in racialized surveillance just is specific to biometrics. It doesn't say like border or things like that. It's about the technology that supports it. But those authors all say specific at the border.
Okay, cool.
Brown and Hugh are what we cite in solvency.
Cool. I sent it. It's 4 off. Framing. Wait, I think I might have set the wrong doc. And then the advantage.
Which advantage?
The virtual wall. Okay. Is the doc up now?
Yes.
Okay.
You said 4?
Yes. And let me know whenever it's ready.
It is opening on my end.
4 framing virtual wall.
I'm gonna go yell at people in the hallway. 1 second.
Have fun.
I need y'all to be quiet. People these days think they own the building.
All right. Everyone good?
Yeah, let me mute myself.
Okay.
Cool.
First off is T restrictions. Statutory restrictions in the context of immigration refer to INA and the Title 8, the HS 16. Statutory restrictions, see INA 8 USC, and restrictions on legal immigration refer to entry quotas or grounds for inadmissibility. Topical affirmatives can lift either. Task off 16. Restrictions on legal immigration, there are 2 barriers. Quantitative restrictions which limit the number of people. Qualitative restrictions, people that Congress has determined should not be allowed to live here due to grounds of inadmissibility. And violation, biometrics isn't a statutory restriction on legal immigration. It's a regulation. They're distinct, and they violate task off. Legal bite 17. The word restriction has not been held to include regulation. And voting issue, 2 reasons. 1 is limits. It's impossible to research all 1,300 pages of visa categories and their associated regulations. Scrutiny and Garretum 11. Regulations to refining visa policy, 1,300 pages of codes of federal regulations. And second is contextual precision. Removing restrictions on legal immigration should be interpreted as close to a term of art as possible. It's the only non-arbitrary standard for evaluating interpretation evidence. Consensus of lexicographers vote neg. Shackelford 17. The word restrictions is defined by the best lexicographers to mean limitation. The word regulation has a different signification. It means method is defined by rule or order prescribed by superior for management for the government or society. This more properly applies to the mode and form. The 2 words are not always synonymous, depending upon the context for which the words are used. Next off is the 2020 this ad. Biden leads now, but a narrow Trump win is still possible. Swing states are key. The week 923. Both the Biden landslide or a narrow Trump win are possible. Biden has led for a year, but is by no means home and dry. A handful of states will decide the election in these states. Biden with a polling lead. And Latinx and Asian voters are critical to winning those states. Trump's anti-immigrant policies are driving them towards Biden, but the plan flips support in the election. Patterson 20. Hispanics and Asians constitute 1 in 4 Americans. Turnout could be accelerating. Turnout jumped by 13%. The largest increase in votes for the Republican Party. It stands at 1. Hispanics and Asians has plummeted. Hispanics have backed the Democratic Party. Republican midterms with communities long. 51% believe that Trump and the GOP are hostile toward the community. Hispanics and Asians attach a high level of importance to this election. They are key constituency. The battleground states votes could tip the balance enough to determine the winner. And a Trump win guarantees great power and accelerates climate change. Both cause extinction. Star 19. The impact of a second term would be more lasting. The effects will be impossible to undo. Re-election will put off the commitment to decarbonization while encouraging other countries to do nothing irreversible to people to doom was 2020. Guarantee high risk of nuclear accident and nuclear war. Trump's attack on American alliances and withdrawal from treaties made the world more dangerous. World leaders hoping that he will lose in 2020. His successor will renew America's commitment to allies. If he is re-elected, several countries may opt to pursue nuclear weapons. Next off is the counter plan. Text the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol should stop using biometrics at the border. It solves and avoids 2020 because it's an internal policy which shields a link. They don't have a federal government keyword, which means agencies doing biometric surveillance can just stop themselves. Next off is the entitlements this ad. Corona's causes an inevitable midterm recession, but won't escalate to a depression. Disrupted supply chains, decrease consumer confidence, and low consumer spending. Economy 20. Falling prices in stock markets around the world. COVID had large negative productivity shock. Uncertainty induces people to postpone spending and businesses to defer. This means to demand. We are on a doom loop. It looks inevitable, disrupting the supply chain, forcing interruption in entire sectors. The U.S. economy depends on the optimism of consumers. This has been shattered. Lower confidence curtails demand at the 2. Can reinforce each other. I don't see a risk of systemic meltdown. Halts of production in China is disrupting manufacturing globally. Workers without insurance will avoid treatment of workers without paid leave. Will try to protect their paychecks. This is the biggest vulnerability. And entitlements act to stabilize during downturn, allowing for easy recovery, prevents total collapse. Rubin 17. Anti-poverty programs improve productivity, enable participation, workforce. 20% of children live in poverty, detriments economic future. Medicaid snap improve outcomes. Service automatic stabilize during downturn. People spend money, increasing demand, helping recover. And large influxes of immigration trigger backlash from restrictions. Fear tax increases prompt cuts to benefit spending. Abrano and Hosnell 15. Worries about the long-term negative fiscal consequences of large immigrant population may be shaping the willingness of white Americans to tax themselves to provide basic services. Perceptions could prove a strong motivation for retrenchment. This logic goes as far as to lead to disfitment in core areas. Research demonstrated strongly between attitudes restrictions toward minority groups and non-racial policies, and loss of stabilizers, insurance, and depression. That leads to nuclear war. 2015. Interdependence raised the cost of conflict, and if leaders seriously anticipate their own nation's climate may claim, and they may blame external dependence, appeal to anti-foreign sentiments, contemplate force, and refuse to be deterred. Nuclear arms shift could happen abruptly. The greatest risk is changes in the world economy, circumstances, and ways render interstate peace precarious. This could have consequences with nuclear deterrence. The only factor to protect from Armageddon deterrence could lose credibility. Great powers might gamble into cyber or conventional war. Framing. Extinction outweighs bomb and bear at 18. Some catastrophes are vastly more important than others. With nuclear winter, humanity can go extinct. Loss of all future generations. 500 trillion lives may be an underestimated risk. It was probability times magnitude. Society should try 500 trillion times harder to prevent a global catastrophe than to save a person's life. Society should make large investment in GCR reduction. Even tiny reduction merit significant effort. While everyone has the right to their own views, strongest arguments for the widely held position that all human life should be valued equally. Philosophers speak of a veil of ignorance in which considers what is best for society, irrespective of which member that happen to be valuing everyone equally. Suggests a very high value for reducing GCR, and war outweighs and re-entrenches structural violence. Horgan 12. No conditions in and of themselves against militarism. War causes inequality and scarcity as much as it stems from them. War is not a product of any single cause. Rather, war is fueled and sustained these injustices. Once we have escaped war, we will have more resources to devote to other problems like economic injustice, which war exacerbates. Those who want to make the world a better place should make abolishing war a priority, because peace can bring other changes. And in the context of debate, probability is irrelevant. Drop arguments are presumed to be true, which makes the probability of them unrelated to risk. That means they must actively disprove the DA's theory, not just claim conjunctive fallacy and wish away their framing. It's basically the DA is super unlikely. Trust me, it is the burden is on them to prove. So if not, you vote neg. The virtual wall advantage. Border biometrics are good. It prevents terror. Kimmery 18. Biometrics crucial to stopping terrorists at borders. Biometrics are increasingly critical to verifying travelers are who they say they are. Terrorists try to mask their identities. It's a lot harder for them to fake fingerprints. That's why we collect biometrics. We take fingerprints, facial scans, and use that to run against our watch list of terrorist warnings circulated via our global network. Continue to help countries to interdict foreign terrorists as they attempt to cross the border. Every country that's serious about protecting borders would benefit. We confront a dangerous environment in which multiple terrorist threats faces all the more reason to get serious about biometrics. And terrorism causes nuclear retaliation, collapses the economy, and deterrence. Fallout alone kills millions. Rothbun 17. The likely consequence of explosion of a single terrorist nuclear bomb, blast fire, initial radiation, long-term radioactive, could kill hundreds of thousands, and aftershocks will ripple through the world. Numerous government studies concluded to be plausible. Sophisticated terrorists who could make a crude bomb. There have been some 20 seizures of stolen weapons, usable nuclear material. Such a bomb would release 10 kilotons of explosive energy. The ionized plasma would create an electromagnetic pulse, shortening all communication electronics nearby. The explosion would destroy the city's ability to respond at global economic disaster. The economic impact of such an attack would be enormous. The effects would reverberate so far they are difficult to explain. Insurance companies would go bankrupt. Banks would be left holding an immense number of mortgages that never be repaid. Enormous security and military investments would be likely. The potential for widespread spread havoc is real. The country attack might lash on military without the nuclear threshold already crossing the Syria. Its conceivable resulting conflicts might escalate to nuclear. International politics could become violent, with states taking nuclear action by force to ensure their security. And a virtual wall stops smuggling of humans and drugs. That's good. Herd 17. Of existing border fencing, hundreds of miles are in need of repair. Drug cartels are using more modern tech than we are. What we need is a smart wall. The recent horrific smuggling tragedy is a stark reminder there are 9 major criminal organizations operating in Mexico that have zero regard for human life. A smart wall could detect crossing and follow individuals until they're safely apprehended. And securitization is good. It's key to promote action to stop existential threats. Male 17. The most effective way to motivate political interest is to reframe it as national security issue. Lifted above the routines of normal politics. HIV/AIDS during the mid-2000s, there was a concerted effort to securitize the disease, and it was particularly successful. The moment led to a considerable amount of resources and attention directed towards the pandemic. There must be an objective existential threat. The objective security must be morally legitimate. The security response must be appropriate. Realist, wary of the dangers of militarism. Realism contains some resources to challenge securitization. And no endless wars. Security motivates people to pursue constructive means to sustain peace and prevent large-scale catastrophe. Lifted 01. In absence of the face of the danger can lead to catastrophe. Fear can be transmitted into constructive planning policies. Ordinary people can be motivated to pursue constructive means for sustaining peace and limiting violence. In the absence of this sort of threatening nuclear rhetoric that the United States and Russia indulged in during the 1980s, we can all too readily numb ourselves to everything nuclear. I'll skip the last 2 cards.
Well, let me just delete them.
Yeah. It's just the Carlo and Ali.
Yeah, I got it. If
Yeah.
I don't delete it now, then I'm going to forget.
Yeah.
Is everyone good for cross? Okay, great. Status of the counterclaim?
It is conditional.
Net benefits?
It is the 2020 this ad.
Okay. Why?
It is not perceived because it is an internal policy where ICE and the Border Patrol just stop using biometrics, whereas the affirmative goes through the United States federal government, which necessarily has to be perceived.
How does this stop USCIS from using it? That's what the majority of the app is thing.
We make the argument that all of your evidence is saying that ICE and the Border Patrol is what's using it.
Gotcha. Inherency doesn't say that, but I'll
Sure.
make that argument. Let's talk about what statutory restrictions are. You didn't respond to the statutes and the restrictions in the bottom of the app.
Sorry?
So the 2 cards I read at the bottom of the app directly respond to this.
DHS responds to it. It says all of those things don't count because they're not in the INA or Title 8.
Okay,
It
so
also says that it has to be grounds for inadmissibility or entry quotas.
If I read evidence that says biometrics is grounds for inadmissibility and is grounded in the INA, do I meet?
Sure.
Great. Now, the other decide. It says that there's an inevitable midterm recession, but it's not going to escalate into a depression. So only a depression leads to the impacts
Correct.
of Thomas in 15?
Correct.
I am not an econ major, so can you explain to me like what entitlements means and like kind of break this down into terms that I can understand?
Sure. And the entitlements that this ad is talking about is things like welfare and social security benefits, healthcare, things of that nature that help prevent total collapse. The AF leads to it being cut because restrictionists want to cut it because they don't like immigrants and they fear that it's going to cause an unnecessary drag.
Okay,
Without
wait, but
entitlements,
restrictionists,
the economy collapses.
forgive me if I'm wrong, restrictionists are like old white people. Don't they want social security?
And we're saying they cut things like welfare for immigrants.
So it's
Not
just for
necessarily.
immigrants?
Jesus. Sorry.
They just cut it for immigrants?
They're cutting like anti-poverty programs, Medicaid, SNAP.
Oh, so not social security?
Yeah, Social Security was a wrong example. Sorry.
Gotcha. I'm confused why that's not the case though. That is still considered like a part of welfare. People with disabilities get it. People who are old, that is like definitely a welfare program and is an entitlement.
Sure. I guess the Abrano and Hodgson evidence says that they'll cut it. I'm not sure what your question is.
Okay, so they'll cut social security too. Got it.
Sure.
Where does it say? Where does the link F say that immigration is a key issue?
For the 2020 or the entitlements it's had?
It's 2020. Sorry.
The link Ev says that it's the top issue, and that's why Latino and Asian voters are not voting for Trump.
Where does it say top issue?
Hispanics have backed the Democratic Party. Republican missteps with the community is long. 51% believe that Trump and GOP are hostile toward the community. I
controlled F immigration. It doesn't come up.
Sure. We're making the argument that they hate Trump because of immigration.
But that's not in the F file. 4 minutes for prep starting now. Cease prep, 1:15 remaining. Let me upload the doc. Where is the document? Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. Let me take 5 seconds to find my doc. Cool. 109 remaining. Cool. It is in the document, or in the speech drop, sorry. Let me get my table too, and then I'll give the order. Oh, this is such a lovely angle. Look at that. Is everyone ready for the order? Okay. It's going to be a new off. Then topicality. Then after in order of framing, inherency, advantage 1, advantage 2, solvency. Then 2020 welfare counterplan. Let me get some water and then we're good to go.
Sorry, my mic was muted, but can you repeat the order of the last 3 things? I didn't catch that.
I'm gonna go through the whole thing. So new off, T, framing, inherency, advantage 1, advantage 2, solvency. Then 2020 welfare counterplan. Cool. Everyone good? Nods, nods, nods. Quan? Okay. Y'all are so small with these nods. It's very small in the corner of my camera. I need big. Quan just went. All right. Enter the next should not be erratically read conditional counterplans. They violate cross-sex, prefer one education, strive, incentivize a slew of condo and weak off case position, discourage in-depth or consistency, broad discussions, remove detailed debate and critical research skills, first and then their adequacy is key to portable skills and real world policy making. 2, reciprocity, applicants separate out plan or place, kick in advantage of defense, second structural advantage in the anti without another risk of being position. In addition to abuse has already happened since the facts are actually will redo the one area they wipe away any office we choose more stable argument, a table, a vote after uphold a fair and education model to be dropped there, certainly wait for any base like this in the future. Now on T, remember they say if we say we meet the INA and its grounds for inadmissibility, we meet 1, our statute amended that day and expanded the powers. IHA says 19. Enhanced border security visa entry reform act expanded the powers of the immigration enforcement amends the INA. 2, I meet biometric quantitative that takes the base and fingerprints and data that's regulated by machines, rejecting the intertoss and never makes any attempt to make a complete definition, just listing 2 kinds. 3, I meet biometrics and qualitative restriction people who can or won't do it or under the types of people that are barred from entry, i.e. inadmissible. 4, conceded the restriction amended through the MACA 14 that's the D in the framework immigrants are restricted and deemed inadmissible. 5, counter interpretation of statutory restriction immigration include administrative applications of INA law for enforcement and in the INA were T. Dennis 12. LPR's control of the notice of the immigration court and the office for inadmissible and removal from INA. That ability to depend on the precise meaning in terms of statutory analysis and increments in the application statutory provisions being by agency. I mean, by security restriction justifying the INA that's used in immigration enforcement for limits restrictions based on the INA create a better topic. There's federal status for the infinite session legal standards law, enabling session enforcement of peaceful operating for action to perform successful the entire utility to ask all the other words like immigration reform or solve your office without linking to ours. B, ground enforcement is key to stop from them gave outfits the only way to ensure ground including enforcement restrictions. Both places net grounds so they can talk about the increase in immigration and weakening borders. C, education includes administrative applications key to get an accurate depiction of violent school policies and their interpretation of racism, discussions, and her practices, and voters' reasonability as reasonable for immigration reform is the core of the topic of key to check for theory. 2, definitely potential abuse and think we have substantiated debate for the interpretation topic. There's no need to intervene now on the affirmative. On the Brahman-Berry evidence, it relies on the idea of a global catastrophic risk, but this is bad. Group them first of 3 reasons. 1, GCR causes a paradox that the deferral of action. Anything can potentially lead to extinction. The value of extinction is infinite. We can never act if we don't use probability. Then any action links to an infinite impact. There's no way to compare. Second extent, Piatelli 96, GCR relies on a literal logic fallacy, which makes us overestimate the likelihood of events linked together by a chain of specific events. Each improbable step combined together makes the risk of catastrophe essentially 0. 3, none of your evidence truly says the global catastrophic risk is that all life would end. It just says that there would be that it would be troublesome. That's power tagging. It works now in Oregon 12. 1 year, you say war has no cause. They decided that Afghanistan explain all war, then they came from a singular issue to cause war 2. It never says that war has created sexual violence. It says it leads to the same impact. That's why with this link 3, Oregon concludes that we should abolish war negatives and do it. Gets us closer because we are out of securitization. Now in the probability argument, your probability argument is awful. We definitely should be voting for things that are improbable. Otherwise, we're just talking about unicorns versus like a sparkle Taco Bell taco. There's no reason as to why that would be a beneficial debate. Rather, you should prefer probability because that's more real world. Now on advantage 1, actually on inherency, you can cross apply the China 19 evidence to the counterplan. It talks about how USCIS is the one that's using biometrics. It's not just the ICER Customs and Border Enforcement. Our evidence is very specific to USCIS. Now you can also extend Euler 10. It says that liberalism is unethical. You have justified why security might be okay, but not that the system of liberalism is beneficial, which means that all of your dissets link to it, and you should weigh the affirmative first. They don't have a worldview to justify it. This is game over now. But oops, Quan. Now on advantage 1. School biometric border screening constructs a virtual wall that indicative of the biopolitical logic of securitization is conflict inevitable because the neoliberal fear for disorder creates and justifies endless war and a power-hungry attempt to control. So can't solve endless securitization. The more ineffective measures continue infringement on freedom. We outweigh on causality. The veil of security makes their impacts a self-fulfilling prophecy which turns dissets into birth agreements only by voting after we get data breaks in the logic that makes ineffable wars that resolves their ramifications now in terror. Most recent meta studies show decreasing terror restrictions results in fewer terrorist attacks, not the other way around. Plank 20. Every correlation test is conducted results with significant correlation between the number of attacks and restricted policies. The more restricted the immigration policy, the more terror attacks there are. More liberal policy than the fewer terror attacks there will be. Cut the card to B. Now, biometrics are faulty and increase terror in Yield 5. Identifying sex with difficult face recognition systems often fail to identify individually sexualized systems that are who are proactively breaking identify terrorists as already concerned by biometrics are similar opportunities to build up sophisticated identities online given them unprecedented levels of access. Now, I'm not going to read the EMP's argument, but the EMP's link to our framing. You definitely should prefer a structural system or things that are more proximate and probable. Now, on topic 1, their evidence references more than biometrics. There's no articulation as this flow leads to things like radar scanners, and 2, this is on a potential word. They say that biometrics would be potentially good, not that it is in the status quo. We say biometrics is bad, which is the reason why you err off on this question. Now on security, we say that security is bad because it constrains question and policy. That was the B evidence in our B evidence. Also, it's empirically denied when you say no because it decreases war. With the war on terror, war on drugs, and war on illegal immigration, there's an incentive to make things war in order to increase the securitization. Now on advantage 2, it goes cold conceded, which means that you can auto vote out here. Biometrics and immigration parallel colorblindness and mass incarceration. Hill is universal. Supports racialized surveillance. Marks bodies ontologically insecure through digital output visualization through new algorithmic Jim Crow, creating further structures of violence void of your social suspicion, which means that you can auto vote here based off of strength of link. Now on solvency, you've conceded 100% strength of link that a critical biometric consciousness has spills over into other events. Now go to 2020. There, link says absolutely nothing. It ever says the word immigrant or immigration is key issue. The Latino voters have other reasons to hate Trump because they have other reasons to hate Trump too. Trump wins. Salmon 20. Polls are not accurate. Gauge for the data up to 2016 is correct. Clinton would be harassed and enduring strength. Evidence for Republicans present matters. Plans for creating negative narratives. Put up plans in the defense. Biden's a candidate that has flaws and articulate out of touch and progressive voters when changed in cyber security. And he will not vote Democrats. I do not working the working class. Cut the card at class. And Trump's anti-immigrant stance is key to his re-election in 2020. Salmon 20. Trump declared that elected to build a wall. Became the campaign of his election campaign in part to the 2020. The question will be raised again. Trump definitely claims successfully regarding anti-immigrant policy. Trump and validity zero tolerance will enable authorities to act with recognize that the top ballot could win swing states. One of the key areas to immigration. Now on welfare, your link up says absolutely nothing. Ever says the word immigrant. Goodness gracious, I don't have this evidence. We would say that immigrants increase the number of benefits that we get from increase the number of benefits too. They wouldn't go to Social Security because that's something that benefit. You should definitely be erring heavily affirmative on this question. Welfare is something that restriction is sliced. Now on the counterplan, you can cross by the inheritance of harm to both. It resolves all of the links because we can get it from all of the agencies. Definitely default to the affirmative on this question. You can weigh advantage 1 first because it has a 100% conceded strength of link. I will clean up the doc because apparently copied and paste things in the wrong place. I also cut some cards.
Okay, my mic was muted, but I'll wait for the cards before I start.
Yeah. No biggie.
Mm-hmm. I deleted the old doc and the new doc is up. Sorry about that, y'all. All right, I'll start prep. Condo T. Okay. Anyone not ready? Cool.
Conditionality, interpretation, we get one with no cross applications, cross applications closed. Condo's good. One is risk averse. Giving negatives a fallback strategy encourages research as opposed to scenarios. That's key to topic entry. Second is info processing. Deciding how to respond to large amounts of information is a portable skill to confront info overload. The forces that have choice and adaptation. Hard debate is good debate. This turns their education standard. Defending against more positions is not better for research skills, and we get to learn more about immigration policies. Third is Netflix. Condo is necessary on a topic where all dissents are non-unique or politics and there are no generic counterplans. Their interp means counterplans and case become bad strategy. It kills core neg ground, makes being neg impossible because the 2AC knows what we're going for. It could spend all their time there. Turns education and fairness. A or neg. The affirmative gets infinite prep and the first and last speech. Here's defense. You should reject the argument, not the team. And A or neg. We only had one conditionality. All of their standards are only applicable if we have multiple condo that skews them. And I'll answer reciprocity here. Kicking out position is good for Netflix education. That was at the top. Info processing turns their offense. Forces them to choose the best offense in the 1AR. That's better for education. Straight turner on this side solves their offense. Even if conditionality is bad, we're justified because they were untopical and we had no other choice. T comes first. Go to T. Our interpretation of statutory restrictions on legal immigration must be in the INA or Title 8, and the topical affirmatives can only remove grounds of admissibility or increase entry quota. That's 1 and C task. I prefer our evidence. It cites the INA, which is the backbone of U.S. immigration law. That's the most accurate definition with the most intent to define. They violate. Biometric surveillance at the border isn't written into the INA, and it isn't a ground for admissibility or entry quotas. If anything, they're a regulation on immigration, not a restriction on immigration, which is what 1 and C Shackelford says is distinct and proves that they are not topical because the wording of the resolution is restriction, not regulation. You should evaluate competing interpretation through a lens of contextual precision, even if their ev is theoretically preferable. Default to the 1 and C Shackelford. He cites a consensus of lexicographers on the epidemiology of the term restriction. It's the most precise interpretation of the word because every single current guideline cites the Shackelford decision. Read our evidence holistically. Only we have the intent to define the resolutional mechanism. Tassoff has the intent to define restrictions on legal immigration. All of their ev just talks about immigration, regulation, and restrictions, but it doesn't have intent to define it, which means you should reject it on face. The we meets, they don't. The app doesn't reduce caps or grounds for inadmissibility. It's a rolling back of a regulation on biometrics, which means the limits DA applies to all their we meets. I'll answer that specifically here. The 1AC DHS evidence is awful. It just defines laws that enforce biometric policy, but it doesn't specify that those laws are restrictions on legal immigration, which means it doesn't have any intent to define. You prefer our interpretation. The 2AC IEHS evidence is even worse. It is even about immigration restrictions. It only mentions immigration enforcements. That's distinct because it's a regulation, which is what our evidence is criticizing. It also doesn't mention biometrics even once. The biometrics are quantitative we meet. You don't meet. Tassoff says only removing entry quotas is topical, not just anything to do with numbers. Think about what their we meet does for limits, and you shouldn't reject Tassoff. It has the intent to define and cites the INA. That's the best evidence on this question. They make an argument how biometrics are in the INA. No evidence has been read on this issue. Even if it's true, they still violate T Tassoff because biometrics are not necessarily a ground for inadmissibility. There's no intent to define. It doesn't once mention that enforcement is the same thing as restriction on immigration. It doesn't mention biometrics. Inadmissibility standards is our interp. Their evidence only talks about inadmissibility standards, which is our interp. They don't meet it because their evidence doesn't say biometrics. Biometrics are not an inadmissibility standards. Those are things like if you're a terrorist, have a criminal record, and or likely to be a public charge. This means that all of their we meets link to our off-limits offense because it justifies apps like getting rid of ICE or stop patrolling the border. These apps and the one I see are at best effects T because they feed out residual actions that eventually lead to a reduction of restrictions. They can shift out of our offense, i.e. the app claims that biometrics cause deportation, that getting rid of biometrics stops it. That isn't a direct reduction of restrictions. It's an independent voter because it allows for an infinite amount of actors or actions that can eventually affect visas, which makes neg research impossible, and supercharge our limits to this ad. I'll extend the limits to this ad here. It outweighs their offense. It's try or die. Even if it's hard to be affirmative, it's impossible to be neg without a functional limit. Their interpretation changes the focus of the topic from large-scale immigration reform to tiny, minuscule changes to regulations. Including regulations and enforcement explodes the limits and makes neg research impossible and prep impossible. We have two internal links. First is there's over 1,300 pages of immigration regulations. That's hundreds of potential new apps, which is an unreasonable burden for the negative. Second is exploitation. The Mater's exploited world with no limits. It creates a race to the margins for the smallest apps. The expedite admission process, hire more judges, interviewers, eliminate paper requirements, pay immigrant travel fees, and give immigrants lawyers all become topical under their interpretation because it could be spun as something restricting immigration while not being a legal restriction on immigration. You must hold the line on the phrase restrictions on legal immigration. It's a term of art, and only we have defined it. Unless their entry quotas or inadmissibility, vote neg. This turns any of their offense, limits and prerequisites to clash and determines equitable ground. Extreme argument of nuance and education over core topic controversy is only possible under a limited topic. That's key to negative strategy. Exploding neg research burdens makes clash impossible. That means every debate devolves into a race to the margins where affirmatives break new small asks about small changes in immigration policy, and negs are forced to go for cheating counterplans. Politics or generic this has a no apply. That's terrible debate for debate. Only limits ensure the neg is prepared to clash, which is fundamental to having an educational debate. Debate is pointless without education. Now, our term solves this because it limits debates to inadmissibility or quotas, which means that it incentivizes in-depth research on how changing standards implicates restrictions on visa categories. Entry quotas focus the debate on why quotas exist, and inadmissibility standards focus on that. Nothing precedes T. It comes before all their offense, including the condo theory, because it's a question of whether this debate should have happened in the first place. If they were untopical, we were justified in abusive strategy since we had nothing else to say. I'll answer their offense here. They say they control limits. Look, we're the only team who has read Ev with the intent to define. That means you defer AF on this question because we're the most contextually precise. None of their evidence says biometrics is in the INA, and none of it has intent to define a restriction on legal immigration, which is a term of art. Their ground argument makes no sense. Durable fiat solves Trump dumping, and it doesn't matter if they multiply neg ground because it only matters insofar as we're prepared for it. We can only be prepared if they're within the scope of the resolution, which they obviously aren't because of the limits this had. The education argument. If we win a violation, the risk of the impact, it means that this education their education needs to be excluded from the topic because it explodes limits. It's infinitely regressive. I can say nuking China is important to my education, but it doesn't mean that it should be part of the topic. Vote neg.
I believe I had 109 left. Yes. Taking now. Let me get my triple tote, and the order is just going to be T. So I know that's a big surprise. Alrighty. 3 minutes. Can I get really big head nods from everyone if they're ready? Quan, that was not a head nod at all. Okay. This debate is over when Quan concedes reasonability. That was right at the bottom. It wasn't in the document, but I accept it. Reasonability. The F is reasonable. It's written in immigration reform is the core of the topic. You've conceded that immigration reform resolves for your other arguments. We should be able to look at restrictions. We should be able to look at regulations are necessarily included in immigration reform, which means that other terms in the resolution check back. You've conceded this argument, which means it's automatically game over. They haven't articulated why immigration reform wouldn't include these arguments. So they continue to make the articulation that restrictions on legal immigration is a term of art. I call BS. It's not statutory restrictions. It's a term of art. Restrictions on legal immigration definitively isn't. You conceded the IHS 19 evidence because you say that it never says that it mentions biometric, but IHS talks about the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Reform Act of 2002, which expanded the Immigration and Nationality Act. Guess what the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Reform Act justifies? It justifies biometrics. That was the C in solvent. That was the C in framing. You've conceded that. They also conceded the fourth IME, which is that the MACA 14 evidence talks about how immigrants are restricted as a result of it, which shows how the immigrants are restricted and deem inadmissible if they refuse to submit biometrics and if their biometrics come back faulty, which means that there definitively are people that are coming out. They say we have to say caps. The cap for immigrants accepted without biometric cards is 0, which functionally means that we are a restriction on immigration. You were able to read enough evidence. I was getting slayed on substance, but I was getting slayed on substance, which they still could have gone for. You have also conceded that you shouldn't vote for potential abuse. You shouldn't vote for potential abuse. I know that this judging panel really likes that T is a model, but it's a question of what actually happens in the round. My F is not abuse, and everyone tries to say that it is, but in actuality, it's not. It's game over when you conceded that it's not a question of a model, but rather what happens in this round. Theory and topicality should be a means to check abuse that happened now, but it happened now, not happen future. You haven't made no justification as to why that necessarily is true. Now, go to our counterinterp. The counterinterp says administrative applications, i.e. enforcement, is necessarily okay. That's what biometrics is through the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Reform Act of the INA. You make no articulation. You say this doesn't say biometrics, which means that's not true, but the argument that you make as to why we're not in the INA is because we are administrative applications. The articulation you make is that it's a regulation, not a restriction, but that evidence makes no intent to define for immigration. It's talking about taxes, which means you should prefer our evidence on contextuality. The Dennis 12 evidence is literally talking about legal permanent residents and people that are deemed inadmissible or removable under the INA through the administrative applications, i.e. Enhanced Border Security and Reform Act, which means you should be airing heavily affirmative on this question when we have so many conceded pieces of offense that go conceded pieces of defense, especially under reasonability. Reasonability means that if you think that there is a 1% chance risk, there's no. And we don't even need to win a 1% chance risk because you have conceded evidence that shows that we definitively meet your interpretations. Immigrants are deemed inadmissible if they don't have biometrics. The cap of it is 0. That's what the Dennis 12 evidence says, which means that we meet your interpretation too. You've conceded that we are in the INA through the IHS 19 evidence, which is the first I meet, and the articulation, both of the two arguments that are on the affirmative. You have not line by line them or responded to them, means we win.
Good round.
Good round. Can we do an air high five, Quan?
No.
You're just breaking my heart today, Quan.
You know COVID's a thing going on right now?
Air high five!
Asshole. Social distance.
First you tell Chad that you have no means of contacting me, despite the fact that
I forgot
we
Facebook
each other.
existed.
Last night, yeah, you forget that you have me as a friend on Facebook. It's fine. I know I mean nothing to you, Quan.
It's true.
Looks like everybody's in. We got everyone. Quan, Rob, Kelsey, awesome. Everybody ready for me to announce? Yeah. Nods. Okay. Oh, Quan, that was a little more. That was a decent sized head nod. All right. The decision is a 2-1 for the affirmative from Western Kentucky. Rob, I think you were the neg vote, so.
Yeah, I think also it comes from like having a legal background. So I think I really dug into the competing interpretations part of this. So like the way that I like kind of it comes down to for me is that neg is basically saying there's a regulation, and that's not the same thing as a statutory restriction. And I think that like he's probably right. I think that he does like cite these like cases, and he cites these other things that like we're talking to about different areas of law, like tax law and like contract law. But like tax law is like also super like dependent on regulations. And I think that your evidence, specifically the IEHS evidence that you cite, and you say that, oh, this is actually a statute, and this is like the statute that amended the INA. If you actually look at the evidence, it says that the statute actually only authorized appropriations for INS, or not the statute. If you look at the text of the card, it only authorizes appropriations for INS, Border Patrol, and consular personnel training facilities and security-related technology, right? So like for me, this isn't like actually, this implies that it's going like through a bureaucratic agency that then creates a regulation. And I don't think that that's like necessarily a statute. I wouldn't call the regulation in my mind a statute when it's going through like an administrative agency. And so I think that like A, Quan wins that, and then B, I think that like he's probably right that this probably just does explode off ground. Like regulatory law and administrative law is like such like a difficult thing to examine because they have continuous changes. In fact, they literally like push out like rule changes on any given topic on any given day by there's like dozens of them, right? So I think that he's right that it does explode like off ground quite a bit, and also makes it really hard for him to like argue back. I also think that he like let's see, what was the last part? Yeah, and then he wins the idea that like limits is key to education, because otherwise like if there's no meaningful clashing around, then like no one's getting like educated, because like I don't know, like there's no real test of the affirmative. If you can just like I don't know, use like a really like niche regulation that nobody even knows about. So anyway, I also thought that he won the term of art debate. So that's why I ended up voting neg.
Kelsey, do you want to go? I can go first if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I thought this debate was pretty close, but I do think that both the explanation in the 1AR and the explanation in the 2AR, that it is a qualitative restriction on entry, because if you don't show up for your biometric screening, you're not allowed into the country. And that's just like a truth claim that I think you're behind on, Quan. I do think there are a couple of arguments that kind of shape this decision. The first is the just kind of question of qualitative versus quantitative restriction, I think hurts you in this debate. I think you should just be going for quantitative restrictions only. You can only remove or release the cap. That's the only fair or predictable interpretation, because qualitative standards can be anything from hair color to job performance or terror. Like there's just so many different qualitative standards. I think a better interpret in this debate probably would have been just quantitative standards. The cap is the only predictable number we can debate on. Second, I think that counterinterpretation, while it's not contextually precise, is probably reasonable. I do think that, for example, if a person said that the plan stops Customs and Border Patrol from detaining and deporting asylees entering the country, so it's an asylums act, negatives shouldn't get to argue circumvention because agents are racist. Like I think that the interpretation that the AF is asking for is that included in removing restrictions, qualitative or quantitative, includes the like administrative application of those things. So we could do the plan, but you have to be able to allow them to administer the plan in some way. I don't know that that's a best interpretation, or necessarily if that's exactly what the AF interpretation was, but given that she met the like original interp, it's not as big of a deal. It was kind of my fallback. And typically I would default to competing interps like it says in my philosophy, but I don't think you really have an answer to reasonability that I have in the NR. And even if I think I default to competing interpretations, I don't necessarily think your limits DA is a winner, because there are other functional limits on the topic. But I just think, Tess, your 2AR responses to the limits DA need to be a little bit better on like how there are other functional limits, things like into, or things like solvency advocates, or just like argument filtering, like i.e. badass aren't going to win because they're bad and they don't have internal links, so they're just going to go away, right? So like there are other functional limits, and you can combine that with like a non-uniqueness. Debaters don't listen to the limits anyway. It doesn't matter how many times somebody votes against you on T, you're still going to reach your non-topical AF in the next debate, right? Like you're still going to be beating your head against the wall to try and prove that it's topical. So like those things are all non-unique, plus the like there are other functional limits I think would have taken out a large chunk of that limits DA and the 2AR. Having said that, I don't necessarily think that in a world where I vote on the counterinterpretation that it necessarily explodes limits beyond a reasonable research burden. Quan, I thought your NR was fantastic, and I think not having had that kind of inadmissibility standard qualitative restriction part at the top, I mean, it's one of the better T's I've heard in my 3 or 4 years judging in this activity. So, you know, we were really close and took me a while to think about it.
Yeah, I think everything that Justin said too. I think coming out of that rebuttal, I think it was more close than right before when Tess was done. But I think where things become problematic, at least for me, is I think that the DHS argument that's in Tess's AF is pretty preemptive of this T, and I don't think that Quan really responds to it. But furthermore, I think Tess does a really good job linking back to the Tassoff evidence that talks about qualitative, that literally mentions health decisions. Right, that I think that we meet is a pretty damning argument as far as the we meet is concerned. But I do think that Quan makes a really interesting argument that I wish that you would have exploded on a little bit more, is that the AF doesn't reduce any caps, right? It just rolls back this regulation, which is why we're talking about it. So functionally, there's no solvency or advantages if there's no route to that internal link scenario. And Tess, I don't think that you have a really great answer to it, but then I have all of the reasonability arguments, plus I have the we meet, and I have the counter interpretation that I think you're doing a good enough job on to solidify an AF ballot for me.
Great. Thank you so much for judging. Quan, good debating you as always, even though you refuse to nod and air high five me.
Yeah, good round.
Bye, all. Have a good
Bye-bye.
rest of your day.